Hi,
Hello.
everybody hear us okay? Cucumber, you hear us?
Mhm.
All right, I got one more. I think this is Jacopo trying to admit him.
Have you had people kind of like Zoom bomb your meetings?
No, not yet. I've had just pretty good luck with people coming and going as they please, but nobody trying to spam or do anything weird. I've heard uh I've heard a couple of people talk about dropping porn into the middle of corporate meetings and things like that, but that would go over okay here. I think everybody would have a laugh, but nothing too bad has happened yet so far. I've got somebody in the waiting room. I'm hitting admit and it won't come in, so I'm just going to go ahead and start with everybody. Um, I'll hold off on muting everyone right now unless we've got background noise problems. But um, like I said before we start, if everybody just wants to, as we were talking, just look at the chat box and just see I've got a couple of requests to keep this running smoothly. But in the meantime, please welcome Alex Gladstein. Most of you probably know who Alex is. He is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Human Rights Foundation, and he is an advocate for using Bitcoin to improve lives around the world. So, Alex, if you'd like to describe a little bit what it is that HRF does and what your role is there.
Sure. The Human Rights Foundation focuses on promoting civil liberties around the world, especially in countries that have the unfortunate circumstance to be ruled by authoritarian governments. So we have a focus on kind of studying closed societies and figuring out how we can help people who live under closed societies, which is important because it means there's a distinction between an open and a closed society, which I'm sure we could argue about all evening. But at the end of the day, about 4 billion people live under a government that doesn't permit any sort of independent media or really any sort of NGOs or civil society groups to form, or doesn't allow free and fair elections, or doesn't allow citizens to sort of sue the government or change it in any meaningful way. So there's no real accountability. So I think all societies are flawed, but some are just structured differently. And for a lot of folks, they don't even have the ability to really pressure their government without risking their life. So those are the societies that we focus on. And actually, our current focus at the moment is a lot of what we do is bring these incredible activists and freedom fighters together from all around the world to one place. It's like the Oslo Freedom Forum series is one of our events, and obviously we can't do that right now with COVID. So we're starting a virtual series of events. The first one's called COVID Con.
Yeah, I
So
didn't
I'll
know
just,
about that when I first booked you, but I heard you talking about it the
yeah,
other
so
day.
people can check it out. But we're going to be exploring the human rights impact of the kind of global authoritarian response to the virus, and what's legitimate, what's not legitimate, what are certain countries doing that seems to be effective, what are others doing that seems to be ineffective, and is there a blueprint for defeating this thing in a way that is let's call it where you'd feel very proud as a country to defeat it while giving up zero ground on civil liberties and privacy. That's like the question. We're also looking into the origin of the pandemic and how it was covered up by the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization. And we have all kinds of amazing experts talking about that. The first day is basically all about China and China's expulsion of journalists, China's silencing of doctors and citizen reporters, China's kind of like way that they have the American society kind of pinned down with regard to supply chains. We have Kyle Bass talking about that, which should be pretty interesting.
I'm glad to hear you say that because most of my questions today more or less revolve around that. So
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have Melissa Chen, who's a Singaporean journalist who lives in the United States. She's going to be interviewing him. That should be interesting. We've got journalists who've been kicked out of China recently from the Times and the Wall Street Journal who are speaking. We've got a very famous Chinese dissident who's going to give I've seen the draft, a pretty amazing presentation about just kind of how the Chinese government has covered up the virus and how it's been cooking the books on the numbers. So that's going to be great. The second day is more global. We're starting with Iran, looking at what's happening inside that dictatorship and how that was like the second kind of epicenter for the pandemic. And then looking more broadly at Russia and Hungary, especially. We have Ann Applebaum and Gary Kasparov, who are going to be weighing in on that. And then looking more broadly at Latin America, the Middle East, Africa.
Yeah.
And then we have like a concluding interview with Naval Ravikant on the idea of, what does the citizen-state relationship look like post kind of pandemic, which I think is really interesting. So I'm pretty proud of the program we have. I think it's pretty killer. We're adding a few more people as well. And we're going to also dabble a little bit. I have a session I'm doing, and I intend to press the issue on sort of like this idea that some people think we should all be like giving the government our data and our location data, and that somehow would save us.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people
would possibly backfire.
Yeah, I mean, look, but a lot of people are willing to do it or don't care or whatever. I mean, it's a range, right? I mean, I don't care because, for example, this is a public recorded thing, but generally speaking, you shouldn't be using Zoom for anything that you don't think is that you think might be sensitive. I mean, it's there's a reason why the Taiwanese government has banned the use of Zoom in its government, because the CCP has some sort of unclear control over some of the data. It's not clear, but it's pretty difficult because what else are you going to use? So
that was a concern of mine, that there is an irony in, we're talking about human rights, we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about China, and I know Zoom is
it's public, so who cares? But like for stuff that's not public, it matters, right? So here's the problem is, if they can co-opt the world's leading voice sort of video conferencing technology, and they can co-opt the World Health Organization, they can co-opt the United Nations, this is a problem, right? And they can co-opt the US pharmaceutical chain, and they can do all these things. These things were very, very carefully laid out, and my opinion is they're going to try and co-opt their currency as the reserve currency as well, in the next 50 years. That's obviously their goal.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about those issues in our group chats on Fridays, and the idea of global reserve currency replacement. Is China and Russia going to go after the petrodollar? And what becomes the replacement for that? Gold and Bitcoin seem like the obvious possibilities there. But
I mean, who knows? It's unlikely. It seems unlikely it's going to happen anytime soon, just because the US has such a massive advantage in terms of all other governments needing to settle in dollars. Maybe you're seeing that broken a little bit in terms of what Putin's trying to do. But I mean, for like the average country, like they need dollars to settle. Yeah. So I feel like we're far away from that, but you never know. If you do look at these situations of like where the dollar would become so weak or unreliable that governments would be forced to use other currency. I mean, if you actually look at the history of countries like Zimbabwe and post World War I Germany and like Cold War Hungary, like these weren't like strong economies in a recession. These were like absolutely devastated societies that either went through war or, you know what I mean? So like hyperinflation just doesn't happen to like a normal country. It happens after like many, many years of like obvious infrastructure collapse and defaults, right? Yeah. So we'll see. I've been pushing this on some of the pods I've done lately, but it's fun to read that book, The Mandibles, because it actually tracks fictionally a collapse of the dollar. And in that aspect, it happens really fast, because essentially the president of the United States like says that they're going to default on certain debt, and the rest of the world had like a plan to like go to something else. So that again seems like far from where we are, but it does seem like the Chinese government obviously wants to take the torch, right? But we'll just have to see. I mean, it's not clear if they're going to emerge from this any stronger than they went in. The economy there seems like it's going to it has already been totally wrecked, and we're only allowed to see the positive. You have to understand, we're only allowed to see the most rosy stuff out of China. Like all the bad stuff is buried. Like the fact that there's probably 100,000 people that died of COVID, we don't even know. It's totally buried. The fact that the economy's collapsed, like we don't know. We can see from satellite data that like there's just no pollution and therefore there's no economic activity, but their numbers don't track to that, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that I've been studying for a long time. Like even some scientists out of Cornell, or no, rather Bucknell, about 10 years ago did a study where they looked at economic growth that China and Burma reported versus you can actually see if you track luminosity at night of light of satellite imagery,
Hmm.
it actually correlates to economic growth. So they just found in their research that these governments were lying. So
Yeah.
obviously they continue to do so, but it's difficult to figure out exactly how much they're lying. But they lie through their teeth about having gulags in the northwest part of China where they say they don't exist, and yet like I can go to Google Maps and just find them. So
Yeah.
it's pretty wild because the whole world believes them. Like literally at face value, you have every single mainstream media organization just reprinting the data that they give out. So like I just don't find that helpful. It's amazing how credulous people have become.
Yeah, I have a lot to ask about COVID-19 and China in particular, but I had a general question before we dive into that. About to the best of my knowledge, as far as I can tell, you and HRF speak out about Bitcoin more than any other human rights organization,
Uh-huh.
which, unfortunately isn't even saying much because I don't hear anybody else talking about it. And are we,
Yeah, I can get into that for you. Sure.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. I'd love to get into that for
Yeah.
you, that area.
Are
Um,
we missing that, or is it something that is talked about a lot in the human rights NGO community?
yeah. Just to answer this check question in the box super fast. Yes, definitely. Like if you look at Japan and Sweden and even like the Bay Area of California, where we have 3 million people and like relatively small number of deaths, and like I can leave my house and I'm not going to get arrested. I can go out and live my life. It's fine. If you look at other countries like New Zealand or Iceland, etc., like clearly like democracies are doing the best job. And then like some super performant authoritarian governments are handling it well, but you have to understand they're city states. Basically, I'm talking about Hong Kong and Singapore. These are very exceptional, highly, high income, very advanced economies. Most dictatorships are getting wrecked by this thing. I mean, if you look at Iran, Russia, you're going to start seeing stuff coming out of it. Egypt is like there are people in the government in Egypt dying. So virtually all the dictatorships are going to get wrecked by this thing. There are 2 city states which happen to make all the news, but even they are having like a second wave or whatever. So I think all this surveillance and police state stuff is all for naught. Like you want to defeat this thing in a way that uses like open, innovative values. But getting to the question at hand, yeah, I think it's really the short answer is it's really hard to understand Bitcoin, right? And it's really weird and it's super bizarre and it's the trap. And I've seen someone draw this before, but it's basically like it's like a I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like it's the depiction of like the hill you have to climb to understand Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
And there's like this first little hump, right? That you, let's say down here, and then it's like, okay. And it's like you learn about blockchain and cryptocurrency usually because that's like all there is, and it's impossible to cut through all the chaff. It's not easy. You're like, oh, this seems cool. We can put anything on a blockchain. And then like most people just sort of check out mentally there and they don't like go further. They're just like, oh yeah, blockchain's like a new up and coming thing and cryptocurrencies are cool and they're all pretty much the same. That's where like 90% of people just stop, right?
Yeah.
And then for the people that keep going, they get really disillusioned because they start reading about all the scams and they realize that like all these projects are nonsense and it's very disillusioning. So everybody who didn't stop mentally in the first stage stops in the second stage. And that's where you find a lot of people who are just turned off and who just like look at me crazy when I talk about Bitcoin. It really takes a lot of intellectual persistence to cut through those first 2 stages to get to the super long kind of flat, and then it starts to go up like this trend of like putting in hours of work and then having a result of having a better understanding of what Bitcoin is. And that takes many, many months and years. So very few people in the mainstream media are willing to put in that work. And therefore, the people who they typically inform are woefully underinformed. So it's kind of a weird like defense mechanism, but Bitcoin is not, immediately digestible for the average person, to be honest.
The way that I like to use the analogy for similar to the curve you're talking about is, when you first learn about it, you hear the term the blockchain. And then as you learn more, you realize the term the blockchain is ridiculous. There are many blockchains. And then as you really get to know things, you're back to, no, there's really one legitimate blockchain.
Yeah, no, we're like past a lot of the, I mean, it'll obviously come again with the next bull market, but like we're past a lot of the bubbliness in terms of, I mean, there were a couple of years there where people would write to me and they'd be like, can we talk about our new blockchain project? And I'm like, sure. And I would get on the phone with them and I'd be like, what blockchain are you using? And they couldn't even answer me. And I was just like, how can you, and this would be like legitimate people who were working with like the World Bank and like governments. And they were like, oh, we're creating our own blockchain. It's like, man, how do you even begin to unpack how stupid that sounds?
And why are you doing that? What's the point of that?
Yeah. Like, what do you desire? And in reality,
and then you get blockchain iced tea on the stock market going up.
Yeah, no. So like, I believe the reason why like most nonprofits, human rights groups, humanitarian organizations, etc., news desks don't understand the power and potential of Bitcoin is because of basically I consider it kind of a social attack. I mean, not waged by any one person in particular, but in 2014, 15, 16, you had the blockchain, not Bitcoin thing, which is super powerful. I mean, really, really, really powerful, to the point where today, most people think that's the answer. Like most people numerically who've heard of blockchain and Bitcoin think that it's blockchain and not Bitcoin. Like today, like most smart people who read The Economist or whatever, who might be intelligent in some other field. And they really all hook, line, and sinker take the bait on all of the traditional criticisms of Bitcoin, like that it's used by criminals and spoiling the oceans, and that it's doesn't have intrinsic value, and that it's too volatile, and all this stuff, that it's centralized in China, and you can go blow by blow with them. And if you actually sit down and talk to them and take the time, I do think they open up a little bit, but no one's going to do that. Right. So what you're left with is the mainstream media and like, mainstream organizations with this loose kind of vague apprehensiveness about blockchain and cryptocurrency, because they know a lot of it is like bullshit. So they kind of just like keep it at arm's distance. Even technologists who should know better, I would argue, actually, especially technologists. I kind of want to make an argument that like the more you know about coding, the like more likely you're going to be wrong on Bitcoin, based on the people I've spoken to, at least.
Yeah, that's been my experience. The people who come,
it's crazy. It doesn't, and maybe that speaks to the fact that Bitcoin's not a technology. It's not a technological innovation. It's a social innovation. So, or however you want to call it, a political innovation, an economic innovation. Yes, it is a technology, but so is money, right? Money is also a technology.
People who have an economic background seem like they tend to grasp it faster than people who come from purely a coding background.
Yeah, I mean, look, the people who grasp it the fastest are the folks I work with, who are dissidents around the world who live under dictatorships. Within like 5 minutes, they're like, wait, there's money the government can't control? Tell me more. Mm-hmm. They're like in right away. Now, of course, like that's why I tried to write the little Bitcoin book with the help of many others and try to speak around the world and promote, because there's not a lot of content that is digestible at that stage, right? Mm-hmm. About the political power of Bitcoin. So that's what I've tried to do, is target that kind of group of people who are open-minded. If you're not going to be open-minded, then I cannot help you, right? Bitcoin will force you to be open-minded later with its price increase. And then of course you'll get interested. But if you aren't open-minded, I can't help you right now. Yeah. And that's unfortunately just sort of the deal for most people. I've been doing this talk series for Singularity University for the past 2.5 years. And I speak to 75 CEOs. It's a lot of fun, actually. And I give a talk, it's like 40 minutes long, about the future of money. I talk about what China's doing with central bank digital currency stuff. I talk about corporate money, which I would generally describe as everything from Libra to DAI, any digital currency controlled by a corporation. And then Bitcoin, which is like, open source, permissionless, decentralized money. And then I kind of break it down for them. These are the 3 kinds of money that are going to become dominant in the future. here's the pros and cons of each, right? And I try to teach them about the future of money. And man, the Q&As are intense because all the bankers really want to argue with me and tell me how stupid I am, you know? And I'll just never forget this one interaction I had where this guy from Santander, the Spanish bank, he's like, oh, like my team's done all this work and, you know, we figured out that like most Bitcoin is used for money laundering. And I'm like, okay, what if I were to tell you that your bank has laundered more money
really?
in real dollar terms than there exists Bitcoin, like just
Yeah.
in the last 2 years alone? And then he like couldn't, he just got like super angry. And then there was another banker from Mexico who stood up and said, actually, you know, I'm a banker in Mexico. We launder all the money in our country. All of the laundering in my country is done through banks. And then this other dude stands up from Switzerland and he's like, yeah, how do you think we got so rich? It was like a really amazing scene. But it just shows you that some people are willing to be open about their profession and some aren't. I think a lot of people are so emotional in their reaction to Bitcoin because it challenges some of their most base assumptions about life. So they don't get so aggressive. Like the course I teach is alongside the future of robotics and AI and all this other stuff, right? And no one's getting like emotionally fired up about these other talks, even though if a lot of them are like total fluff or whatever, they don't care. They're just like, oh, that's cool. And then they score the professors. And I'm looking and they anonymize it so I can't see, you know, who the other professors are and what their scores are, but I see mine in relation to everybody else's. And there are all these people who get like basically a 4.9 out of 5, which is like, I mean, how boring. Like really, it means you provoked nobody. And, you know, mine's always like a 4, where, I don't know, 70 to 80% of people thought it was great. And then like 15 to 20% like hate me, you know, which is really the goal. You have to be provocative. Right? But I'll never forget that. And it shows me the power of this social attack that happened or was waged or whatever. And it continues to confuse and fluster people, and it will continue to do so. So, you know, just talking about, you know, the number of times I walk into a room or a meeting and I'm like, yeah, we'll talk about Bitcoin and human rights or whatever. And they're like, what do you mean Bitcoin? I thought this was going to be about blockchain or whatever. And I'm like, no, let's just focus on Bitcoin. The number of times I've heard that is at this point just innumerate.
Yeah. Well, I think money itself, I mean, you hear all kinds of definitions from people, but one way to think about it is it's a distillation of all of our concepts of what is value into sort of a, let's call it a tangible form, even if that's not literally true. But I think once you start to challenge that, you are touching on things that are very core to people, what it is they value and how do they determine what they value. So that gets a little bit contentious for sure. And it, you know, it's very personal, and then it also becomes local, national government, all that kind of stuff. But it gets into what is at your core of what you value and how do you value it. And when you go there and push those buttons, people get, you know, they've never thought about it explicitly before.
It's such a groundbreaking thing that it's so extraordinary and so bizarre and so different that when presented to someone who's never seen anything like it, of course, their first instinct is denial.
Yeah.
So that's why you get this like emotional hot response from most folks.
Yeah.
And you really have to walk through with them. And I do my best, but like at the end of the day, everybody's going to have their moment where the penny drops and they realize, oh, this is actually really cool. But to be honest, like it took me a long time to get there. I mean, the quality of content is so much better today than it was like 4 years ago or whatever. But when I was first picking through this stuff, it's like, which is funny because the quality of the content 4 years before that was way better. Like 2012, 2013, 2014, if you go back and look at what the journalism about Bitcoin, sure, it may have been focused on the Silk Road, but at least like the writing was accurate. Like the way that they would actually write about Bitcoin, totally accurate. If you actually, I shared this the other day, but there's a really good Freakonomics Bitcoin podcast from 2014. It's the only one they've ever done. And sure, you know, they have like this Ripple shill on and they have a regulator on, but they really nail the Bitcoin part. And they have Mark Andreessen come on and he nails it. And that year he also wrote a piece for the New York Times, which was like, still to this day, I think the best short essay about Bitcoin. And there was some really good stuff from Wired. And honestly, this New Yorker essay that was written about in 2011 about Bitcoin it's probably the best essay I've ever read about Bitcoin. So there was a lot of amazing journalism about Bitcoin that really understands or understood what it was in the beginning. And then this social attack came in 2014, 15, and it just kind of blew everything up. And it really forced people off of Bitcoin into this other stuff, which was nonsense. And that really like kind of like broke the chain. And only in the last 2 years have you started to see like, I don't know, a lot of like, you know, maybe better content, just because there's so much more Bitcoin content than there was before, right?
I'm hesitant to steer people when they have questions to, for example, like banking on Bitcoin. It's available on Netflix.
No, there's like zero good video content about Bitcoin.
Yeah. And you know, it's, the documentary is fair enough as far as it goes, but it's so out of date. And
I mean, you can dig around. It's hard to like get inspired from a technical panel discussion. I mean, I basically say, I mean, what I normally steer people towards is one of Andreas Antonopoulos' talks. I mean, you just need 30 minutes if you're willing to sit down and watch. And you should be able to, like, his talk on the global banking cartel is fucking awesome. That's the one I usually steer people towards. So if they can, because again, it's not really a talk about Bitcoin. He doesn't talk about mining or whatever. He talks about the global banking cartel. And then you're like, wait, this is so fucked up. Like, and then he kind of brings it in that, hey, there's this other thing. And I think that's the right approach. And that's why he's been so successful, I think. And why his content has been so great and so pivotal, especially for me when I was beginning, you know. I just, you know, remember he's got these, he's got this talk he's given somewhere. I think it's in 2016. And he's like, hey, this was the Bitcoin conference when I first came here. Now it's the blockchain conference. I think next year it's going to be the distributed ledger technology conference. And then God knows what it'll be after that. So even then he was noticing how the quality was deteriorating. And you notice colleges and universities all had Bitcoin clubs, right?
Yeah.
All the Bitcoin clubs got co-opted, most of them at least, into blockchain clubs. Mm-hmm. It's just like, by whom? Like, who is there to do that? It's ridiculous. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just a bizarre thing. It's like a great drift intellectually off the path that happened. And it definitely like pushed us back many years, but maybe it was inevitable, you know?
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if some of that, if it was good that it happened back when it did.
Maybe it was a great thing that it happened because now everybody has ignored Bitcoin. Most people have ignored it. They know it in the back of their mind. They saw it go to $20,000, and yet they're just willing to pretend to live in a world that doesn't have it, you know?
Yeah, and it
really
gave
weird.
us time. I say us. I'm not a developer, but it gave the Bitcoin community time to prepare for a different era. You know, and got some of that stuff like Mount Cox out of the way early on. So I wanted to segue a little into COVID and China, but so I think a lot of us, and I'm embarrassed to say myself included, have been kind of naive about the relationship between China and NGOs, exemplified by what's going on with the WHO. I was shocked to find out their relationship and how they seem to be taking marching orders to a certain extent from China on what they're reporting. I was naive about that. I had no idea that that was the case. You probably were not.
Well, it's so shocking that you're like, wait, I thought that this was like basically the UN. And then you have to go back and say, well, what does the UN actually do? So in 2016, the World Health Organization visited North Korea, which is, of course, you know, like Potemkin Village type scenario where it's sort of like the Hunger Games. You're visiting the capital and then everybody else lives in the District 12, right? So there's video footage on the North Korean state, you know, propaganda channel that they have a YouTube channel, or like some fan has, where, you know, he or she puts DPRK propaganda on YouTube, and you're watching these WHO officials go to the like birthplace of Kim Il-sung and like lay wreaths like at his feet. And you're like, this guy was like the mass murderer, like seriously, like number of bodies, like he's got to be top 5 personally, right? Through his decrees and his orders, how many people died that were innocent. And yet they're just kind of hanging out and like happily kind of laying wreaths. So that was in 2016. So I had known about this for a while, and I'd seen the WHO be very friendly with dictators. So this is a similar disease that exists in all these multilateral organizations. And you know, maybe it's their curse, because if you want to take the approach that we can have a conversation with all governments, no matter their structure. That's not going to be a helpful conversation, because those governments are literally just thieves. I mean, they are people who stole power and stole the money. They weren't elected. They don't deserve to be at the same table as people who were elected and serve as, mouthpieces of the people. And maybe we can be skeptical about democracies everywhere from Chile to Japan to the United States, but in reality, that's the structure. There are like elections which rotationally put different people in charge according to the whims of the people. And that's just not the case at all for the majority of nations, which dominate at these large multinational organizations. In the last 15 years, China has done a really good kind of co-opting them. Like the UN Human Rights Council was reconstituted in 2006. And China has been censored 0 times since then. 0. Yeah. Meanwhile, Israel's been censored like 70 times, and maybe North Korea 10, and et cetera, et cetera.
China was just named to some committee, 2 days ago?
They've been on the Human Rights Council for years and years and years.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is so perverse. And then people get into the argument of, well, should America be on it or not? And who knows? I mean, I think you could be of two minds. On the one hand, like it's pathetic, and why should we be backing it? A, but B, you have to realize from a realist point of view that if we do leave it like we did, okay, then China fills the gap, and it's a more powerful tool for them. And you can kind of be of two minds. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like it's not. There's no good answer as to like what the U.S. or Norway or Australia should do with the Human Rights Council. It's unclear. I mean, short of creating a new one, but that's not like really feasible, which is why we do what we do at HRF, because we believe that essentially at that political level, there's only so much you can achieve. I mean, you have to really work. Our goal is to influence pop culture, the technology sector, private individuals, the mass media, the mainstream media. That's kind of where HRF focuses on, because at that level of the WHO and the UN, I mean, they're so bought and paid for by dictatorships, obviously, that it's just, I mean, I don't know how much of a difference you're going to make,
Well, that brings me to the second part of my question, because with the WHO being such a surprise, it's got me thinking now, how many other NGOs, including human rights ones, do we need to worry about that they're maybe being, under the table influenced by China?
Well, everybody's influenced to some degree by their supporters. But I mean, there are such things as gongos, which are like government organized NGOs, which are fake NGOs, but those seem to have lost a little bit of steam recently. But there's a lot of, what they call AstroTurf, like fake grassroots organizations out there. Just have to do your diligence. But, when it comes to world organizations, you should just assume they're all corrupt, and then, don't trust, verify type scenario. Like, look at FIFA. I mean, look at FIDE. The chess one is so corrupt. It was serving as a money laundering outfit for the Russians. I mean, obviously, we've discussed the UN Human Rights Council. There's like a women's rights council. They had Iran on it. It's not a joke. The World Health Organization has proven its total uselessness. We could go on and on. Most of these I mean, there's once in a while you'll find one that's redeemable, like the UN, the refugees arm of the UN does some good work, but like even they have been like accused of all sorts of horrible like war crimes, basically. So it's difficult. It's very difficult. And even in the private sector, the big foundations fall victim to the same sort of issues. Like, for example, the Gates Foundation they don't fund any civil liberties or free expression work. Nothing. And you're like, really, with all that money? But they're like obsessed with this idea that they can just get the quality of life. If they could just kill the diseases and viruses, they'll work with anybody to do that. And that's dangerous, because that leads you to work with dictators. So Bill Gates is famous for his love of dictators, but maybe not in the average American's mind, but like in the human rights community, we know this. He's like serial supporter of brutal dictators. ranging from Kagame in Rwanda to Zenawi in Ethiopia, etc. And I think it came from a place of like, I'll work with anybody to like get to my goal, right?
Yeah.
And you have to understand this is true also of like the effective altruism movement, which was born in San Francisco and in Oxford, places that have a lot of civil liberties. And they try to tell rich people what they should donate to as a matter of what would be most effective per dollar. And you look at their lists of like what you should donate to. And of course, there's nothing related to civil liberties in the top 10 because they don't care, you know? And it's really a fatal mistake because you cannot even monitor the progress or effectiveness of any efforts inside closed societies because there's no free press. So what, I mean, how are you going to judge how your malaria net campaign is going in Zimbabwe, where there's no, you know, where there's limited free press? You can't. Like the government could just make it up.
Yeah.
So this idea that you can somehow tackle the like socioeconomic rights without tackling the political and civil ones is, I believe, a horrible misconception.
It harkens back. A lot of it
continues to just curse the world.
A lot of it reminds me of the early 20th century progressive movement here in the United States. You had people who were openly disdainful of the separation of powers in the Constitution. The idea was just, well, we just need to get our dictator in there to do things, and they'll fix everything up and make it right. It's not seeing the forest for the trees.
I remember in 2005, I was still in university, and I was taking a course at the School of Oriental and African Studies about Islam and democracy. It was an amazing class. Like half the class could recite the entire Quran from memory, and then the other half were like more Western, right? So you're going back and forth, and the first third of the class was like Western philosophy. The next third was Islamic philosophy. Then we looked at like certain countries. And I remember our debates about what would happen in Egypt. And we were like, hey, what's probably going to happen is there's going to be an election at some point, and the Muslim Brotherhood's going to win. And then they're like going to kick the ladder off and become dictators. Yeah. And that's essentially what literally exactly what happened, except they weren't allowed to get to where they wanted to go because the military came back. In, I guess, right? But some of these things are kind of predictable. Like dictatorships create a desert of civil society where only things like scorpions can grow. So it's a long, hard road to democracy because a lot of the institutions and social fabric that is required for a thriving open society is not there in a dictatorship. It's just not there. I mean, people just don't know. They haven't been allowed to create those horizontal connections amongst each other, right? So it's just such a tremendous victory anytime you see a society move to the more open, away from the closed, right?
Yeah.
And each one needs to be celebrated.
Yeah. What you were talking about with Gates, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in what I was going to talk about because it sort of connects to that. Bitcoiners in general, and myself especially, tend to be free market absolutists. And I would say if you'd asked me a year ago, I probably would have been. I'm questioning some of that a little bit in terms of, do you really have a free market relationship when you're dealing with a dictatorship like China? And even before all this happened with COVID, you had things like the scandals in the end. I'm calling it a scandal with the NBA and their sort of self-censorship when it came to Hong Kong because of all the Chinese money involved in the NBA now. And a point that was made that I thought was really good was that when we first opened up, we meaning the United States, I'm American, opened up free trade with China in the 90s, the idea was that it was going to make them more like us. But we found that it's making us behave more like them, or some of our organizations at least behave more like them, and accepting that. And we're seeing it with like the Red Dawn remake had, they made them change who the enemy was in that in Hollywood. The Top Gun sequel, there's changes that they made to that, and it's not even out yet, but that's known. Do you have any thoughts about how we are going to be able to alter that relationship going forward? I mean, that's a hell of a knot to untie.
Yeah, well, I think just for starters, you have to be principled. The free market is a natural phenomenon that can be bent in one direction or another. But yeah, I mean, sometimes the free market would dictate that you should exploit somebody or sell your stuff to China. And that's where you need to just say, no, I'm not going to do that. And that is not quite rational from the perspective of the free market, but I think people need to stand up and be principled, or else long term they will be in a situation that is not very free market. If you were like dependent on the Chinese government for everything, and the Chinese government comes to you and says, hey, we're gonna if you don't do X, we're gonna do Y, then you're kind of screwed, right?
Yeah.
And that's largely, I mean, it's happened to America in many ways. Is a lot of our like supply chains have been like too reliant on the one country, right? So I think you just need to like keep your head on a swivel with regard to the fact that, I mean, you do need principles. We can't be like mercantilist about everything. I would even say inside Bitcoin itself, it's not like, I mean, Bitcoin's a replacement for central banks, not for banks. Like people are still going to like make loans, right? Like this is still going to happen, right? So a lot of the financial system's still going to exist, even if Bitcoin, ultimately succeeds in what me and many others, think it might be able to do. There's still going to be a lot of the functionalities of today's financial system where recklessness is still possible. Of course, it's not going to get rid of that. I mean, really what it does ultimately, and for me at least, is if it's the base money and no politician can just create more of it to like sweeten up a deal with his friends, that would be great, right? Like that's cool. So you reduce the ability for people to control the money spigot to manipulate that. That's amazing and totally life-changing. But that doesn't change like the downwind effects of people are still going to want to gamble. People are still going to want to be reckless. Like that's human nature. So I tend to think that this idea that Bitcoin will sort of change everything from that perspective is maybe a little off. And yeah, I mean, it's something where with regard to the free market, yeah, like the NBA should not be in China. Like, I don't think they should be going to seek business with a government that has 1 million Muslims in prison camps. Like, I know that they can make a lot of money doing that. Like, I know LeBron can make a lot of money doing that. I know that Dwayne Wade and a bunch of others made a lot of money doing that, but that's not the right thing to do. I mean, it's like, don't do business with fascists or communists or any sort of brutal dictator. Like it's not going to turn out well for you in the end, would be probably my guess.
I have a question on this topic regarding supply chain and reliance on other productions. Mm-hmm. I know there was a proposal to take down the sanctions towards Venezuela and Iran because they literally have no equipment to deal with the virus. They have no masks, no gloves, and all that stuff. And U.S. kind of ignored it a few times. So how do NGOs deal with that?
I'll speak for myself personally, but I don't believe in the effectiveness of nationwide sanctions. I think they're really stupid and very harmful. I do believe in smart sanctions, which is something that a guy named Bill Browder created, and that's why we have the Magnitsky Act in the U.S. Congress. So what smart sanctions do is they target specific individuals who are complicit in crimes, whether they be war crimes or murder of journalists or whatever. And those people are no longer allowed to own assets in the United States or travel to the United States, etc. I'm all about smart sanctions. I think that countrywide sanctions are really just harmful and bad. So, like, I don't think we should have countrywide sanctions on Iran. I know that some people will say, well, it's less deadly than going to war, but I just feel like that's a slippery slope type thing and a bad argument, a bad faith argument. So it also just gives the dictators like what they like. It's not like the Iranians and the Venezuelans and Cubans would all of a sudden become like much more desirable as governments if the U.S. government like didn't have sanctions. Like, they would be exposed for the horribly corrupt criminals they are. There's no reason, I don't think, to have these sanctions. They just end up hurting the average person. The elites can get what they want otherwise. The way that you would actually do a fair sanction approach would be to actually just target the elites. Literally names on a list. These 15 guys in Iran, yeah, they can't come to the United States anymore. They're not sending their kids to Harvard, and they're not buying land in California. Screw them. And that really hurts them right where it matters, because ultimately, if you want to grow up and become an oligarch or a dictator, like, why do you want to do that for power and money. And if we can take that away from them, that's going to be great. So it also puts pressure on the actual dictator. So if all the Russian oligarchs can no longer go to the United States, they're going to go back to Putin and say, hey, man, this isn't working for us. Like, I want to send my kid to Harvard. So again, I think we should shift towards smart sanctions, named sanctions on people who are criminals, and do away with this idea that we should just like blockade countries. I think it's super ineffective.
So
I believe it is the case between US and Russia right now. Like, there is quite a big list of Russian oligarchs that are not allowed to the US and any business with the US. But I'm mostly talking about, like, there is no import that is allowed to work to Venezuela right now. And even if other countries want to help with some supplies for dealing with coronavirus right now, they won't be able to. Otherwise, they will get sanctioned themselves for helping Venezuela, let's say. So
yeah, I mean, like, a lot of innocent people are dying because of this. It's really stupid. I don't know what else to say. Like, it's horribly ineffective, and would be my I mean, like, those rich government officials, they manage to get what they want, you know, they figure it out. They get it through the black markets or whatever. But the average person gets cut off, you know? So I'm just, you know, very opposed to those kind of countrywide sanctions.
So turning the spotlight back to the West for a second, have you been able to go through, I know there have been a lot of new surveillance provisions put into the bailout bill, stimulus bill, whatever you want to call it. And I think there's probably stuff that as time goes on, we're going to go, oh, I didn't realize that was in there. But do you have any specific thoughts on any of that yet? Or is it?
Yeah, I mean, like, the ink is really dry. I mean, we're in the moment when it matters, right? So I think again, like, I'm somebody who takes the virus very seriously. It's extremely deadly. It's destroying communities around the world. So we have to have a really good response to it. But, like, there are certain things that should be off the table. So cell phone tracking is one of them, I think, both because it erodes privacy and also because it's just very ineffective. If you actually think about what they are trying to achieve by doing it. So I would try to fight the idea that we need mass surveillance. So in a lot of countries, the ship's already sailed. Like, even in democracies like Taiwan, South Korea, there's like crazy mass surveillance happening. I think that's going to be damaging for those democracies long term. Like, that's not a trend they want to go in. Let's put it that way. Like, there might be a anti-CCP, pro-human rights president of Taiwan today, but hey, you know, maybe she loses the next election and the pro-CCP, like, anti-human rights candidate wins. Are you really going to want that party to have all those surveillance powers? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Ditto South Korea. So I just think it's a huge mistake that they're making, where they're just working with telecoms and just kind of sifting all this data, you know, in a way that's, you know, not done with user permission, and they're just tracking people. And I mean, it's led to a lot of social, basically scarlet lettering of people. It's like lots of public doxing, all sorts of weird stuff's going on. So
I noticed that with the corona testing, they were putting, I mean, just every bit of your information in South Korea out there publicly.
It's crazy. So in the United States, I mean, it's unclear. I mean, we don't really know what's going on. I'm in the Bay Area, and it appears that, like, the Bay Area authorities are not doing mass surveillance. And look, California is doing a hell of a lot better than New York. And it appears that we're just going to, like, probably defeat this thing in the next month or so. But we do have like 500 deaths. It's not like it hasn't had a big toll here. So, like, Hong Kong has had like less than 10 deaths. You know, some of these countries have handled it like South Korea has more people than California and has been dealing with this disease in a much more aggressive way and only has 200 deaths. So I'm not going to say that California has been the best, but, like, it certainly has shown that, like, you can be fairly effective in fighting the thing and not use mass surveillance. Then there's other countries which seem to have been even more effective. I just don't know. I don't know to the extent of what kind of surveillance they've had, like New Zealand, Iceland, Norway. I think what happens is, like, people trust their government so much to not do anything wrong that they're willing to give them, like, a pass.
Yeah.
Which, again, dangerous. But as long as we have some examples of, like, large areas of large countries that are heavily populated that have defeated this thing without the surveillance. I think that's helpful. And there's no independent studies that exist to show that like the factor of phone tracking is the difference maker. So if you look at, any of these countries where people would say that the response has been really good, like in Taiwan, like how much of Taiwan's response is because of hand washing and masks and social distancing and an aggressive, informed, trusted government telling people about the virus and, precautions that were taken to limit gatherings on the one hand, and how much of it was mass surveillance. Like, I mean, I tend to believe based on what I've seen that it's almost, virtually all the former and not the latter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not hearing about people being targeted and rounded up individually because their cell phone pinged the wrong tower, right? I mean,
well, they use, in Taiwan, the main thing they do is geofencing. So they just use it to make sure that if you're in quarantine, you don't leave your little spot. But I think there are better ways to do that than like cell phone tracking. Let's put it that way. It's not even that accurate. Like this guy wrote this, it went like viral, but his phone like died. So the cops came to his house. Like,
yeah,
okay, that's a huge waste of taxpayer money. They didn't need to go to the house. His phone died. So, I think again, mass surveillance will create a lot of false positives anyway. Singapore's really struggling with this. They have this supposedly privacy protecting app, which I think is kind of full of it. There's still like a trust level with the Singaporean authorities. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, it's just kind of basic, like, oh, person A and person B, they were like near each other and their Bluetooths noticed that they were like near each other, and person A we know is positive. So, oh, great. So the government's going to reach out to person B in a way that preserves everybody's privacy. That's absurd on its face. How does the government, but the government needs to know who person B is. So like, and they need to know that person A actually is positive. The whole thing is ridiculous. But like a lot of people are pushing this idea that this sort of like cell phone triangulation way, this like Bluetooth optionality, volunteerism way is better, but they all require the government to know, So I think it's all just
the point was made the other day when you were talking to on TFTC. I think Matt Odell said, this idea that it's anonymized. If they see what building you live in and they see what building you work in, that's not anonymized. Like they can figure that out real quick.
Yeah, well, that would be for the geolocation. I'm talking about this thing they've come up with where it's like phone A and phone B are next to each other for like some time without knowing where they were like necessarily before. Like, let's take them at their word that they're only doing like little bits of information. Still, like, how does the government alert person B that they have been in touch with person A? Like, they need to know who person B is, Yeah. Like, it's not like the whole thing falls apart. So a lot of people are getting suckered into this. I get a lot of inbound from people being like, hey, does this seem legit? And it's some like super sketchy project. So I just think it should just be just off the table cell phone tracking. We don't need it to fight the virus. And that would be that for me.
Yeah, it seems like the trade-off, we're not getting much out of it. And to be cynical, it seems obvious that, no, this is something that will come in handy for other things later on.
There's a guy who's the tech correspondent for The Economist, and he's making some good points. He's talking about how, like, here's the thing. If it was effective, you have to think about the extent you would need to go to for that effectiveness. You would literally need to pair the Bluetooth syncing with the geolocation, with surveillance on every street. Then you could, then we're cooking with gas, right? Then we know that person A and person B were like literally 5 feet from one another, not on like a different floor, but like right next to each other. We could see it. We had the camera footage. We could identify them. We knew that they were together for a certain amount of time. Okay, great. Let's call them. But like that involves such a ridiculous amount of destruction of privacy that like it shouldn't even be considered. But like that's what you would need to make it actually effective, right? And we're not even close. A lot of this sort of tracking of citizens has been rolled out in a way where only a tiny percentage of people have been monitored, and therefore it can't really be that effective. But it's part of a bigger story about just governments exploiting the opportunity. Never let a good crisis go to waste. And there are governments ranging everywhere from China to Hungary to Serbia to Venezuela to Sierra Leone, rolling out suspensions of parliaments and state of emergencies and like pauses in the way that like due process works and stuff like that, all for the virus, right? Even in countries where there are no cases. So just be careful. I mean, be careful.
Yeah. Before I open it up to general questions, if there's anything you'd like to discuss that we haven't touched on in particular? You'd mentioned Hungary earlier. I've heard all kinds of conflicting about that situation, but any other issues, whether it's related to COVID?
No, let's get to questions. I just have a couple minutes left, so
Sure.
let's see
Okay.
what folks want to talk about.
All right. It's open to everybody now. I know Katie had a couple points about Russia because that's where she's from, and Bitcoin education in Russia. But if anybody else has any questions too, feel free. All right. Disappeared on me. Jakey, you got anything? He usually has some good points to make on things.
Yeah, I do for sure. Sorry, I'm. So first question is, I just read an article about herd immunity that Sweden is going for. So pretty much all the people our age are just going out with their lives, getting the virus, getting immune, getting antibodies, and that's about it. So far, their cases amount is not any worse than any other countries that responded with totalitarian regimes. So why should we just like, okay, people 55 plus staying at home, we'll take care of you, and the rest of us just going with our lives? Because I'm pretty sure that I had corona and it was sucks, but it was not that sucks of sitting at home for 2 months and having my human rights taken away. So
yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is like my local government has handled this in a way that I don't feel like has taken any rights away from me. And we're doing much better than other parts of my country because people took it seriously. The economic impact is a different discussion. But as far as like the human rights and civil liberties piece, I think it's a false choice. I think we can fight the thing and take it seriously. I mean, the herd immunity thing seems ludicrous to me. I mean, this is a disease that can turn a healthy 25-year-old's lungs into ground glass. There are people I know who are perfectly healthy who are in the emergency room right now. And I think it's sensible to, if you can, stay at home and social distance. And I think the idea that like we should just let the virus run, it's just a barbaric idea that we should just let the thing run its course. Just seems crazy because at the end of the day, like especially poorer people who don't have the means to stay at home are going to be the ones who bear the brunt of that. I think the herd immunity thing's crazy. But I do think we can like defeat the thing without mass surveillance. I don't think we can defeat the thing without a massive economic depression, which is already happening. But, I think that you got to, at the end of the day, choose between health and finance. And I think that it stands to reason that countries that do nothing are going to fare really badly. Like one country that did nothing was Iran at the beginning. So Iran has been so destroyed by coronavirus. Like more than 10% of their parliamentarians are like dead. There are mass graves that you can see from satellite images. So this is a country that refused to restrict gatherings, that continued to allow religious pilgrimages, that basically told people it was cool, don't worry about it, it's just the flu or whatever. And there are untold numbers of dead, so many so that we can see the mass graves from space. So we'll never know the true amount of dead there. I can't imagine it's any less than 25,000, to be honest, but they claim it's 3,000, but that's possible. And then what ends up happening is that every country's connected, right? So Iran has a state airline, Mahan Air. Okay, so Mahan Air people weren't told, the staff of the Mahan Air weren't told about how deadly this thing was. So therefore, they just continued to run their flights to LA and all these other countries, spreading the virus. And that's why one of the reasons why Europe and America are so going through such a tough time right now is because of countries like China and Iran, like not warning the world because they were dictatorships and they were censoring information. So I think the right approach is to be very sensible. This is a real threat, like any other deadly threat to humanity, and we need to like have a really good response to it, but it shouldn't be one that restricts, that uses mass surveillance, in my opinion. So that's kind of where I would stand on that.
How do you feel about the idea of it being like a leaked biological weapon or some, or some project or something like that? Because I mean, it's beginning to seem less and less likely that it came from a bat, at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? The problem is we don't know. I mean, yes, there's like a virology center in Wuhan. Is it possible that something like leaked out that they were trying to develop? I refuse to believe that the Chinese government like wanted this to happen.
Yeah, I mean,
I think the toll on its society has been like far worse than we even know. But could it have been developed? Who knows? There seemed to be some scientific reporting that said that it's not possible that it was created in a lab. So I'm not sure. At this point, it doesn't really matter where it came from. I mean, we should be on guard against these things and have really good plans. Like, if you don't have a plan, that's going to cause the sacrifice of civil liberties, right? So if we're caught with our pants down in New York City and we don't have a plan for when something like this happens, then yeah, we got to call the army in, okay? Like, because we can't have people die, right? So if we actually, like, as a democracy, are smart and like plan for these things ahead of time and practice this long-term kind of thinking, then we don't have to sacrifice liberties later. We can just like figure out what we're going to do and like triage and ration, etc. But because we like scrapped our plans and we were only thinking about the now and not the future, I feel like Bitcoiners should resonate with this. We should always be thinking about the future, not right now. We should be getting out of this like right now consumerist mindset. We should be thinking about how we make our society great long-term, how we make our communities great long-term. And to do so, we need to anticipate stuff like this. I mean, this wasn't even a black swan. It was a white swan. Stuff like this has happened like predictably every decade or so, going back, long time. Like, but my government apparently had a whole department that was supposed to be studying coronaviruses, and they scrapped it for some reason. So, I mean, again, like, it's just a matter of being smart and prepared. And the more smart and prepared we are, the more time we can debate in an open way what should the solutions be, so that we don't have to have mass surveillance. But if we push it off and deal with it as it comes, then yeah, there's going to be a lot of like emergency decision making and a lot of suspensions of civil liberties, and I just think that's bad. So hopefully this thing teaches us a lot about like the way that we need to be prepared for stuff like this in the future, whether it's earthquakes, tsunamis, asteroids, pandemics. There should be a plan for all of it, in my opinion.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions from anybody? All right. So Alex, before you go, thank you again for joining us.
Super fun. Thank you for having me.
Talk about what anybody can do to support Human Rights Foundation. If Oslo Freedom Forum is still scheduled as normal, or
yeah, well, like, we had to postpone it, obviously. So in February, we postponed our May event just because we knew it was going to be dicey. So that turned out to be a good call. But look, we're going to try and do it in the fall. But we won't make it public. We won't make an announcement probably till June. We don't even know if sports are going to happen in the United States. Like, no one knows right now. So that's why the main thing you can do right now is check out covidcon.com and join us next week. It's going to be great.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it was awesome. Take care.
Thanks very much.
See you, everybody.